Macroeconomic of the nation, we have Mr. Emmanuel. Also, we have Mr. Kabil Jani, the North and Strategy, Premium Pensions Limited. Shall we appreciate, make a special recognition of the money? I also of Mr. Christopher. We are going to go straight to the welcome remarks of this great discourse as I invite.
This is stuff as an economist, so we have the honor to have Professor with us. I hope we should clap for him now. Huh? And what's happening? Our speaker, panel of the panelists. Let me just stand on the protocol that has been established to just go straight, because it's here, we believe, keep it very smart. So distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th National Economic Art section organized by the Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria, Center for Financial Studies, in collaborations with B.Adedipe Associates Limited. As you're all aware, this section was initiated in 2014, designed to bring together captains of industry, subject matter experts, and seasoned practitioners to discuss emerging and pertinent issues facing both the national and global economies, as well as their implications for businesses in the coming year. To facilitate this session, resource persons have been chosen to discuss topical issues in the preceding year while availing their insight and focus on emerging trends set to shape the new year. This year is no different, as we are privileged to have in our midst some of the greatest minds in this country, and I dare say the continent has to offer. Dear colleagues, this is a special moment in history where at the start of a new year, a new decade, and a fresh opportunity to make a positive impact. We welcome a week of relatively new policies intended to boost economic activities in the country, signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, after the launch of the Creative Financing Initiative, the finance bill, the land border closure to prevent illegal smuggling of food products, and so on and so forth. Indeed, 2020 is a special year, as we will feel to a greater extent the effect of such policies. The benefits, as well as the impending risks for operators not fully equipped, knowledge required to navigate new terrain. It is for this reason that the theme for this year's edition is titled Managing Potential Risk, Unlocking New Growth Opportunities, and Influencing Government Policies. As earlier mentioned, unlocking new growth resource persons will avail their insight and expertise on these issues, and more, which will no doubt equip participants with the tools needed in making expert business decisions and uncovering new opportunities. Without usurping the role of our distinguished speakers, permit me to lend my voice to an issue which I believe deserves specific mention. Our manufacturing sector has immense potential to be the powerhouse of the Nigerian economy. In the wake of the developments such as the border closure policy and free trade agreement, as previously mentioned, Nigeria now more than ever before should look inward to resolve gaps in demand for both consumer and industrial goods. We are also expected to develop the capacity to compete in an increasing globalized market. Unfortunately, due to infrastructural deficits, economic recession, and other such setbacks, output and in turn growth of the manufacturing sector over the past 5 years, on average, has been negative. I would therefore like to use this unique opportunity to call on our leaders and the banking community to jointly avail further support to this sector. Support should come in terms of greater financial investment, improved infrastructure, such as improved power supply, adequate grid network, capacity building, as well as special policies, for example, granting tax relief to encourage indigenous operators. Only then can we compete with other African nations and comfortably take our place as the giant of Africa. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as part of the advocacy role of the CIBN Center for Financial Studies, outcomes from this session will be developed into a communique and circulated to major stakeholders in the economy with a view to influencing policy at the national level. I therefore look forward to a thought-provoking and interactive sessions. I welcome you all once again to this August event and wish you an enlightening session. Thank you for your attention and God bless you all.
New growth opportunities and influencing government policies. As you are aware, the Nigerian economy recovered from recession in the second quarter of 2017 after 5 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Although crude oil export is the major foreign exchange earner for the country, the non-oil sector's contribution to the GDP is gradually increasing. The return to growth was supported by a combination of swift and far-reaching monetary policy measures, as well as implementation of policies contained in the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan of the Fiscal Authority. The ERGP is aimed at ensuring food security through strategic reform of the agricultural sector, developing sufficiency energy through fossil and renewable energy, and the promotion of cottage industries. Other objectives include sustenance of macroeconomic stability through complementary monetary and fiscal policies, as well as execution of projects aimed at reducing the infrastructure deficit. Notwithstanding the gains recorded, as evidenced by the several months of relative macroeconomic stability, increased investment, improved production indices, and sustained exchange rate stability, the path to recovery and growth has been bumpy and severely tested by both domestic and global shocks. On the domestic front, key headwinds remain the subsisting structural imbalances, insecurity, weakened infrastructure, a narrowly diversified economy, and constrained monetary policy mechanism. Also, protracted supply constraints, constrained fiscal space, high unemployment, and elevated poverty levels have continued to plague growth. More so, domestic demand, private sector credit, and investment remain lower than expected. Nigeria's economic structure increases her vulnerability to the oil sector, which does not augur well for long-term economic stability and development. As a small open economy, Nigeria is vulnerable to global shocks such as negative international crude oil price, monetary policy normalization in advanced economies, trade tensions, tightening of financial conditions, and regional trade charters. Therefore, the impact of spillovers from global shocks is contingent on the structure of the economy and the degree of economic diversification. On the balance of evidence arising from the impact of the recent global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008 and the 2016 economic recession in Nigeria, the consequences of disruptive shocks on the poorly diversified economies were quite evident. Diversification of the economy therefore offers broad spectrum for enhanced revenue earnings to support sustainable economic growth and development. Thus, rebalancing the structure of the economy and fast-tracking economic diversification cannot be overemphasized. A diversified economy will assist in solving the problems of high unemployment, uneven development, persisting inflationary pressures, wide income inequality, high poverty level, and high level of insecurity. Regrettably, overcoming the weak diversification malaise seems to be intractable since the emergence of Dutch disease, with the dominance of crude oil as a source of foreign exchange earnings in 1973. Broadly diversified economies can contain the unintended negative consequences of global disruptions quicker relative to the narrowly diversified countries such as Nigeria. The ERGP recognizes economic diversification as one of the critical means of achieving inclusive growth in the country. It also identified the agricultural sector as a key priority sector that must be leveraged to actualize this goal, given the rising socioeconomic challenges facing the country and the urgent need to tackle them head-on to bring about improved social well-being for the citizenry. Dimensioning diversification according to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change entails three major issues that should be of interest to us: the products diversification, export diversification, and income sources diversification. One cannot but agree that as a nation, our economy is not diversified. As our major product, export commodity, and revenue source is crude oil. Let me quickly add that while Nigeria produces and exports other commodities, these commodities belong to the narrow range of traditional, primary, and basic exports that do not only earn very little in foreign exchange, but also vulnerable to fluctuations in commodity prices, demand, and extreme environmental conditions such as drought and floods. So far, the Central Bank of Nigeria, through the implementation of heterodox monetary policies, have been able to sustain macroeconomic stability. Overall, the focus of the central bank encompasses the sustenance of price and financial system stability and inclusive growth. This presentation reviews the present macroeconomic conditions in Nigeria, the monetary policy, and the outlook for the Nigerian economy. So we'll quickly look at the present conditions. Against the backdrop of expansionary fiscal policy stance, the Central Bank of Nigeria, since the post-economic recession, has pursued a tight monetary policy to achieve price stability, anchor expectations, and restore the economy to the path of sustainable economic growth. Monetary policy is implemented through setting of goals, targets, instruments, and accretion and discretion within a monetary targeting framework. The goals of the CIBN is to ensure price stability, defined as a single-digit inflation rate, conducive for economic growth. The baseline interest rate is set by the Monetary Policy Committee, and it currently stands at 13.5%, with an asymmetric corridor of plus 200 and minus 500 basis points. The standing facility window provides and absorbs overnight liquidity of banks, while another key monetary policy set by the MPC is the cash reserve ratio. And this has a dual objective. It is a liquidity management tool and prudential as well as macroprudential management instrument. At its present set level, the CRR targets and sterilizes 27.5% of the aggregate deposits of all the commercial banks during a specialized maintenance period. Also, in the CBN Monetary Policy Instrument Toolkit is the liquidity ratio, recently set at 30%. Typically, the bank frequently adjusts the discretion of credit and maintain a certain level of liquidity in the system to influence operating target. That's the short-term interest rate, the intermediate target, which is the broad money supply and exchange rate, towards the achievement of the ultimate objective of price stability and output growth. To achieve its goals, the CBN also deploys unconventional tools, including risk sector interventions. The objective is to provide support for sectors of the economy that are employment elastic and directly impact favorably on price stability, such as the agricultural sector. The CBN has been very successful with some of these programs, such that import bills have drastically reduced for consumables, such as rice importation, and Nigeria is at the verge of attaining self-sufficiency in rice production. The differentiated cash reserve ratio. This is a new instrument to influence increased flow of credit to private sector, repayable at a single-digit interest rate of 9% or less with a moratorium of 2 years. The introduction of the Global Standing Instruction, GSI, in the banking industry by the regulator is indeed a welcome development. The GSI empowers the central bank to prevent predatory serial borrowers from reneging on their loan with impunity. The GSI has contributed immensely in de-risking lending and reducing non-performing loans. The exclusion of non-deposit bank corporates from participation in the open market fixed income instrument has forced a reduction in the money market yield curve and mild resurgence of the equity market. The financial market remains resilient with stable and a positive outlook. Liquidity transformation into risk assets is progressing a bit slowly. Overall, interest rates are trending low, even though the monetary policy rate has remained unchanged since it was reduced from 14% to 13.5% over 9 quarters ago. The bearish sentiment in the capital market reflected profit-taking stance by investors and weak investor sentiments because of heightened political risks, coupled with contagion effect of a continuous monetary policy normalization in some advanced economies. The money market had remained stable with liquidity buoyed from fiscal injections and repayment of maturing federal government bonds, Nigerian Treasury bills, and the Central Bank of Nigeria bills. The banking industry remains stable as the liquidity and capital adequacy ratios remains above the prescribed regulatory minimum. The risk sector developments. The seasonally adjusted real output is currently below the potential output, leading to a negative output gap, indicating underutilization of capacity in the economy, which has been the case since 2016 Q2, with implications for elevating the level of unemployment. Recent data from the National Bureau of Statistics reveal symptoms of an economy on the mend, with real GDP rising and non-oil sector making modest contribution. Real GDP grew by 2.28% in Q3 2019, compared with 2.12 and 2.1% in Q2 2019 and Q1 2019 respectively. Comparatively, the oil sector grew by 6.49%, while the non-oil sector growth stood at 1.8%. Growth was driven largely by services, agriculture, industry, and construction. The manufacturing and non-manufacturing PMI stood at 60.8 and 62.1 index points, respectively, in December 2019, indicating a faster growth rate compared to the levels in the preceding month. Non-oil growth epitomizes the recent surge in credit growth to the private sector, attributed to the de-risking of banking industry and the innovative loan-to-deposit ratio of 60%, which was prescribed for deposit money banks. Domestic output has responded positively to the favorable credit and weather conditions across the country, and the push towards import substitution and food self-sufficiency appears on track. Incipient inflationary pressures persist because of structural and food supply shocks. Headline inflation year-on-year increased marginally to 11.3% in April from 11.25% in March 2019. In the preceding month due to the impact of CBN interventions.
Headline inflation rose to 11.98% year-on-year at end December 2019, compared with 11.85% at end November 2019. While food inflation rose to 14.67%, compared with 14.848% at the end of the preceding month.
Compared with 8.99 in the preceding month. The progress achieved in the inflation trajectory is attributed to the CBN's tight monetary policy stand, coupled with the impact of significant reforms in the foreign exchange market through the introduction of the OTC futures market and the investors and exporters window, which dampened demand pressure in the foreign exchange market. Fiscal sector performance. The major threat to macroeconomic stability is lack of fiscal buffer and the persistent rise on the level of unemployment. However, the recent increase in VAT and sundry stamp duty represent a step in the right direction. We continue to reiterate our call for a massive public works program to be executed in conjunction with the private sector actors. Nigeria is in dire need to rehabilitate hundreds of its public schools, hospitals, barracks for the security forces, including several kilometers of urban, rural, and farm-to-market routes, dotted all over the country. Government should appropriately incentivize the private sector actors to execute these projects. The big bang strategy should be adopted. Public works program represents a low-hanging fruit and the antidote for the unemployment scourge. Incrementalism will be tantamount to too little, too late cure for the unemployment plague. In the external sector, notwithstanding the relative stability of the external sector, high import is weighing on the current account.
Strong diaspora remittances is expected to be a tailwind to mitigating a potentially higher current account balance. Insecurity and the tepid recovery following the fall in oil prices, which was a trigger to the 2016 recession, have slowed investor appetite. Thus, foreign direct investment, which have been on the slide since 2011, fell to $498.62 million in quarter 3 from $906.9 in quarter 2. Similarly, portfolio inflow declined to $2.59 billion in quarter 3 from $4.46 billion in quarter 2 2019. Hot money is volatile and is subject to sudden reversal at the slightest swings in sentiment. The external reserves at $38.28 billion as of January 8, 2020 is more than adequate to meet 12 months of import obligations. This, I believe, should allay the concerns of foreign investors, though lower than projected oil prices will hurt exports and real GDP growth. The overall balance of payments outlook in the short to medium term remains positive and stable, especially with crude oil price hovering around $60 per barrel and daily production level of approximately 1.8 million barrels per day. With the signing of the US-China Phase 1 trade deal, the global economy is expected to witness a sigh of relief, given the influence both countries have on global economy. The exchange rate of the Naira to the US dollar has been relatively stable, around $360 to the Naira, to the dollar. At the various segments of the foreign exchange market, supported by various measures taken by the CBN, the establishment of investors and exporters window, and the introduction of an autonomous foreign exchange market enhance liquidity in the foreign exchange market. Have we reached the limit of effective monetary policy? Monetary policy in Nigeria has entered the state of overdrive. This is indicative of the weak transmission mechanism, resulting in the reduced effectiveness of the NPR in influencing short-term interest rates in the money market. An examination of monetary policy tools and impact revealed that monetary policy has become reactive. The CBN has no control over fiscal spending, which often blunts the efficacy of monetary policy actions. Milton Friedman once said that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Perhaps in developing countries like Nigeria, inflation is a fiscal phenomenon and the central bank is usually a victim. Among the strategies the Central Bank of Nigeria have employed in revamping its monetary policy tools are The adoption of a broader measure of monetary aggregate, M3. The monetary aggregate hitherto targeted by the CBN was M2. However, it has been observed that a secondary market has developed for CBN bills used for liquidity management. The increasing portion of the bills held and traded by non-residents prompted for the change to M3. Reform of the foreign exchange market. The CBN introduced the interbank foreign exchange market and the investors and exporters window to increase the transparency of foreign exchange transactions, stabilize the naira exchange rate, and increase the flow of foreign exchange in the market. Furthermore, the foreign exchange market has developed beyond spot transactions into futures. In this regard, the contribution of the financial market dealers quotation, FNDQ, in the risking the futures market cannot be overemphasized. Forward-looking monetary policy forecasting tools. The CBN adopted a suite of models to provide forward-looking forecasts, inflation and liquidity forecasting models to aid monetary policy formulation and manage expectation. Signaling of monetary policy. The CBN is improving the ways it communicates its future path of monetary policy to guide public expectation. This is done through personal statement of the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, holding press briefs after MPC meetings, and briefing of the diplomatic community. The fiscal space and debt sustainability. Effective fiscal policy is constrained by weak buffers. The persistence of expenditure gap will continue to undermine the policy of government, cast aspersion on the social contract. With the debt service to revenue ratio rising precipitously, our debt is on the trajectory of explosion, given the slow pace of output growth and the high population growth rate. Debt servicing obligations remain precariously high, as the 2020 budget will reveal. At 2.5 trillion or 23.2% of the total expenditure, the obligation is 14.5% higher than the previous year and could be exacerbated if fiscal revenues and oil exports fall lower than the benchmarks. New borrowing to address spending overrun could spike debt repayments, leading to a higher fiscal deficit, further complicating the deflation process. A quick look at the Nigerian business climate. In the equity market, a general appraisal of the investment climate reveals that the performance of the Nigeria's equities market has remained bearish, owing largely to sustained profit-taking behavior by investors, especially the weakened investor confidence arising from the contagion effect of continuous monetary policy normalization in the United States and the fragile economic recovery. However, the presence of low-price stocks with high intrinsic value present a huge opportunity for investors. And we hope Mr. Warren Buffett will take note of this. Money market. The uptick in inflation in recent times resulted in the real interest rate turning negative. However, the recent growth in credit proves to be a positive boost for consumer credit and SMEs. The loan-to-deposit ratio and the differentiated CRR for greenfield projects are excellent policy responses. The GSI is also helping to sustain the stability of the banking system. Of course, the increase in the CRR at the latest MPC is proactive to stem the liquidity sulfate from the anticipated maturing OMOBs and fiscal operations of government. Fiscal incentives. Fiscal incentives to attract investors include tax exemption on gains accrued on government securities, stocks and shares, exemptions on gains from takeovers and mergers, exemptions on proceeds reinvested, tax relief for pioneer industries or products, exemptions on interest on deposit accounts of foreign non-resident companies, among others. Sector-specific incentives such as loan guarantees for companies in the agricultural sector, 3-year tax holiday for operators in the mining sector, interest drawback on loans utilized for cassava processing, export and tariff-based incentives, among others, have also been put in place. In addition to the incentives, the fiscal authorities are deepening on ongoing reforms aimed at improving the general business environment by eliminating barriers and bureaucratic constraints to doing business in Nigeria. It is worth noting that in 2018, the Presidential Ease of Doing Business Environmental Council, in conjunction with the National Assembly, generated an omnibus bill to de-legislate obsolete laws that create blockages to achieving a good environment in which businesses can succeed. This is very commendable. Foreign exchange management to promote investment. Relative stability has been achieved in the foreign exchange market with the introduction of the I and E window in 2017 and the adoption of a spot and forward windows, which have deepened the foreign exchange market, increased liquidity, and curbed speculative activities. This development have contributed and assisted the efforts of the CBN at maintaining a stable macroeconomic environment to attract and support domestic, foreign investors. Opportunities for trade and businesses. Nigeria signed a framework agreement for the establishment of African Continental Free Trade Area Trade Agreement during African Union Summit in Niamey, Niger, July 7, 2019. The agreement to establish the AFTA launches the single liberalized market for trade and goods and services to establish the rule of law in trade, deepen and expand intra-African trade. AFTA is analogous to the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme, ETLS, and relative to the rest of the world, intra-ECOWAS and one trade remain abysmally low post-ETLs and CET, that's the Common External Tariff. Long-standing binding constraints remain. Trade-related infrastructure deficiency in terms of power and transport connectivity, the slow and ineffective implementation of the convention relating to the interstate road transit of goods, cost delays along transit corridors, thereby increasing cost of transportation, limited awareness of the business community on the ETLS, continued existence of non-tariff barriers to trade, undiversified export base dominated by primary commodities, especially solid minerals, high cost of production as a result of deficiencies in terms of transportation, energy warehouses, among others. Minimal support to exporters to the region, high cost of doing business underpinned by infrastructure deficit, non-recognition of certificates of origin issued by some member states, and illegal products moving freely. Resolving the binding constraints can benefit Nigeria if the country can expand market access for Nigeria's exporters of goods and services, eliminate barriers against Nigeria's products, and provide a dispute settlement mechanism for stopping the hostile and discriminatory treatment directed against Nigeria. Support the industrial policy of Nigeria through the negotiated and agreed exclusion and sensitive category list to provide space for Nigeria's infant industries, improve competitiveness, the enabling environment for business, consolidate and expand Nigeria's position, stimulate a structural shift in Nigeria's economy towards manufacturing and services, platform for SMEs integration into the regional economy, expanded platform for Nigerian manufacturers and service providers for connection to regional and continental value chains. Doing this will require sustaining openness to trade and global value chains, requires cooperation beyond trade policy on taxes, regulation, competition, policy, and infrastructure, and coordination between countries to enhance investment in transport and communication infrastructure can improve international connectivity. The outlook for the domestic economy. Economic growth remains stable and positive, notwithstanding the slower pace of growth. The outlook is anchored on higher oil prices and production, continued reforms in the foreign exchange market, improvements in critical ancillary infrastructure, and prospect for improved agricultural performance. Achieving the growth projections require effective implementation of the ERGP, diversifying government revenue sources, sustaining the current foreign exchange stability by the bank, addressing insecurity in the country, and increasing the contribution of the non-oil sector. The outlook is predicated on the following tailwinds: deploying funds to critical infrastructure projects to stimulate growth, sustenance of peace in the Niger Delta and Northeast regions, to improve oil production, eradicate Boko Haram menace, to enhance growth-stimulating sectors like manufacturing and agriculture, de-risking the economy to ramp up construction, mining, and job creation through unfettered access to credit. The current oil price benchmark would hover around $60 per barrel as indicated in the proposed medium-term expenditure framework. Rising oil prices strongly correlates with higher accretion of external reserves and enhanced foreign exchange liquidity. This enhances CBN's capacity to build external reserve buffers to support stability of the Naira exchange rate and present a huge opportunity for Nigeria to build the necessary fiscal buffers required to support the economic recovery growth plan. Exchange rate stability is paramount and should be kept at its relative purchasing power parity to eliminate misalignment, while interest rate policy shall be guided by financial conditions and the inflation and other key fundamentals of the market. Global economic growth remains sticky, with threats of volatilities in the financial and commodity markets, trade tensions and unilateralism, Brexit negotiations, and recently, escalating tensions in the Middle East and the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. As an open economy, Nigeria remains exposed to the vagaries of the external sector. Responding to lower oil prices and tighter external market conditions will require the front-loading of non-oil revenue mobilization and rationalization of current expenditure to reduce the ratio of interest payments to revenue to a more sustainable level, creation of space for priority social and infrastructure spending, improving tax administration, tax policy measures, create the bedrock for a diversified private sector-led economy, implementing the power sector recovery plan, investing in infrastructure, accelerating efforts to strengthen anti-corruption and transparency initiatives, and updating and implementing financial inclusion and youth and gender strategies. In conclusion, monetary policy implementation in Nigeria has been resilient. The CBN has avoided the implementation of time-inconsistent policies since the exit from the 2016 economic recession. Monetary policy will continue to be proactive, daring to move beyond traditional tools, and if need be, adopt heterodox policies that would ensure that macroeconomic stability is sustained while taking cognizance of economic fundamentals in the domestic and international environment. Therefore, we need to put our thinking caps and strategies on implementable measures. There are several low-hanging fruits in the fiscal space. These include the privatization of the moribund refineries, creation of public works program to create jobs for our youth, and partial diversification from the ownership of NNPC, just to name yet a few. In conclusion, a robust policy framework is quintessential for unlocking the nation's economic potential and bringing to speed inclusive growth.
Of them. Now, I love data, because that's what I deal with on a daily basis. But data can be misinterpreted and also can be misused to create a narrative contrary to healthy, sustainable development. So now, in terms of the conversation today, I want to make a reference to where Nigeria is supposed to be this year, 2020. 2020 was supposed to be a year of remarkable achievement for Nigeria. We should have by now developed top-notch growth drivers in ICT, in human capital, financial services, that's banking and insurance in particular, mortgage, health, infrastructure, talking to power and logistics, and of course, potable water, sewage, and sewerage. We should also be talking this year about inclusive growth that outweighs population growth. That means we will not just be growing our economy, but we're growing it in a way that it creates jobs. That should also lead to a third thing that we expect should be happening this year, and that is significant reduction in inequality and, of course, extreme poverty. Now, failure to achieve this is the extreme poverty we find is evidence everywhere around us today. Now, I like always pointing to China for a very simple reason. China also set 2020 as the target date to eradicate extreme poverty. And that's the country with the largest number of human beings in the world as of today. And that is unlikely to change in our generation. In fact, should I say in the foreseeable future? Because they've also changed their population policy to now encourage couples to have children, at least 2, so that they replace themselves. So now, what did China do to address what we are struggling with today? The first was they identified the root causes to be 5: rural-urban migration. Nigeria is still steeped into that. In the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a shift of our population distribution. More people now live in the urban areas than we had 7 years ago, switching from 48 to 52, now to 51 to 49, 51% in urban areas. Discrimination against the urban poor was very rampant in China, meaning that the urban poor were so disadvantaged in terms of access to the basics of life that can also make an economic agent productive. Thirdly, there was education gap. And of course, they found access to healthcare as a problem, as well as agricultural lifestyle. Now, if you look at these 5 that China saw 30 years ago, we are still dealing with them in Nigeria today. But we have not really identified very clear-headed strategies for dealing with these issues. What China also did, which is part of why I picked them up as a benchmark and reference for Nigeria, is to relentlessly reform. Because China carried out so many reforms over that period of time. So it was not only reform once, but they continued to reform as they picked on issues that were central to elevating their population to prominence and prosperity. Then, of course, they maintained focused implementation of development plans. And that placed emphasis on delivery of world-class infrastructure within the span of a generation. The one that always excites me when talking about China is their road plan. They had a plan initially to build 85,000 kilometers of expressway between 2004 and 2034, a 30-year period. But by 2007, only 3 years after, China had done 57,000 kilometers out of 85. Then they revised the target date from 2034 to 2010. And by 2011, they achieved it. Railway plan targeted 2012 to now build the longest stretch of railway in the world, longer than that of Russia that held the record at the time. Again, China achieved that, and by 2017, we now had a train loaded with manufactured goods that will leave China and arrive in London. I witnessed it because I was in UK at the time. And I saw when that train arrived with a ribbon in front of it from China, over 3,000 miles as they reported it in the news. So now, that also brought me to highlight for our conversation today that in our ERGP, we stated this, that ERGP is innovative in that it signals a changing relationship between the public and private sectors based on close partnership. In implementing the plan, the government will collaborate closely with, I made those words bold, all right, with businesses to deepen their investments in the agriculture, power, manufacturing, solid minerals, and services sectors, and support the private sector to become the engine of national growth and development. So that was the vision in our ARGP 3 years ago. Now ARGP will expire December of this year. So the question is, we've done 3 years of it, this is the 4th and final year. Where are we exactly, especially in terms of this? So we find therefore a situation where the declaration that private sector will drive growth in this economy, we have not yet gotten there. So that is a gap. Of course, this gives a kind of snapshot of what is happening around the world, which was very well attended by the last presentation. We'll all get copies of my slides, so I won't talk to all of them. Equally, data. Now, you know I told you I love data. So where data is useful, I will tell you what I use it for. What I did there was to use data to prove a point that the government doesn't drive the economy. And it's very simple to establish. Take the GDP of Nigeria and take government expenditure plans. The assumption I made there is that the entire budget of federal government for 2019, that is, they spent everything, which of course we know never happened. Anyway, then take all the state governments as well, add their money to that. All the 744 local governments, add everything they plan to spend. Put it all together, it came to only 9.89% of our estimated GDP for 2019. Meaning that the bulk of the value created in Nigeria is by the private sector. So which means data from that perspective connects to what government said it will do. So the question now for us is, how do we encourage government to do what it said it will do? And the basic argument is, if there is anything that the private sector can do, why should the government engage in that? And that also brings up another country as reference, South Korea. Now, I also like looking at South Korea because of an experience I had in 1988. I was then among a team of consultants that reviewed the steel subsector in Nigeria. And so while we were at that work, of course it was sponsored by the federal government and the World Bank, then an argument came that we were tending towards scrapping Ajaokuta, and that was the sentiment at the time. Someone now said, has any of us in the team been to Ajaokuta before that study? Everybody said no. So we considered 3 teams to visit. I wasn't a member of any of the teams. But the 3 teams came back and said, something must be wrong, and these were foreigners mostly. Something must be wrong with Nigeria to begin to think of scrapping Ajaokuta. So now, where I'm going is this. Ajaokuta itself, South Korea took a replica of it. That is, they took the plan of Ajaokuta and went to build a similar complex. And when they built it, and I always make this in a lighter mood, I have only 2 cars in my garage today, and the 2 of them are made in South Korea. So what that tells me is like a joke on me as a Nigerian. Because South Korea took the plan of Ajaokuta, they built it, they upscaled what that complex does for the economy, and they grew to now start manufacturing world best quality in terms of car. By the way, Kia Automobile won the award as the fastest selling automobile in the US. That's the home of automobile in 2013. So now, the question is, if you look at where we are today, we call this the poverty misery index. That is the extent to which people are miserable. And why are people miserable? Because interest rate is high, double digit. Because inflation rate is high, double digit. Because unemployment rate is high, double digit also. In fact, very high one at that. And of course, the 4th one, because growth is very slow. Because usually we put growth against those 3 indices, and then we work out what it gives us. So the misery index in Nigeria is very high, 60-something%. That means if you are to consider those that are miserable, they'll be looking at people that probably are more than 50% of the population. Now, that brings us to growth. No doubt, our economy is growing, but it is not growing fast enough. Why is it not growing fast enough? Because we are not doing what other nations that have broken the back of poverty did. And like we say, it is not rocket science. It is simply logic. Now, and I will give an example all of us can relate with, and that is within this corridor we are in. Some time ago, the question was asked from a former governor of Lagos State. How did you do it that Dangote refinery is in Lekki? And Fashola said, I went after him. I went to Aliko, and I told him that he should site that refinery in Lagos rather than Ogun State that he was considering at the time. I also heard this in an interview Aliko himself granted anyway. So, and he told him, these are the reasons why you should be in Lagos, number one, and then we give you all the support you need. Now, when I read that interview granted by Aliko, I heard the statement he credited to Fashola. I told myself, I've heard a similar thing done by the South Koreans. Governments there doesn't sit back. Now, they know the priority sectors they are interested in seeing growth, and that will also drive development. They go after major players there, and then they offer them incentives. Now, there's a principle in economics, it goes this way, that people respond to incentives. So if there's anything we want the private sector to do for us in Nigeria, then government should offer them incentives if we truly are interested in that. Now, yes, in the earlier presentation, there was a reference to manufacturing that is expanding. Yes, the data on PMI shows that clearly, that manufacturing is expanding, but we can do it faster expansion. We are still highly vulnerable, largely dependent on hydrocarbons, that's crude oil, condensate, and associated gas. As are the latest data available, we could see clearly that for the first 3 quarters of 2019, 87.46% of our foreign earnings came from oil. That is high vulnerability. Now, I will say something about this because we talk about sovereign debt, that Nigeria has borrowed too much. Now, again, in economics, we may not necessarily share the same opinion. But what I did there was to not take just the figure we have, but relate it to what other advanced countries where extreme poverty is very low or nearly eradicated. And I said, how do I relate sovereign debt to the quality of infrastructure? So when I did a simple covariance without going too technical, all right, I found about 64% covariance between sovereign debt and the quality of infrastructure. And the inference I drew from that is there is nothing wrong with borrowing, but don't borrow to buy food. Which is similar to saying for government, don't borrow to fund recurrent expenditure. So if all we borrow to do is deliver infrastructure, that will do the economy some good, because the velocity of transactions will increase, and when that increases, corporates will make more money, and by implication, they pay more taxes. So government revenue will also grow. So but there we need discipline that comes from two angles. One is discipline of execution. Two is discipline of value for money. Because Nigeria happens to be one of the countries with the highest naira per kilometer of road constructed. Convert also the naira to dollar, the same rate. We are among the most expensive countries in the world to deliver infrastructure. So we need to deal with that value for money, and then of course ensure the money goes into what it is meant to do. This is the table I ran, just that quick covariance. You will also get that. Now, let me go on here to point something now that often is missed in our conversation in Nigerian economy. Imports have been rising very significantly. Our import data for the first 3 quarters of 2019 showed an average of $1.29 billion monthly that we spend on imports. And that's where what I got as, my indicated number of months of cover of our external reserve is different a little from what we had in the paper presented earlier. If you take our external reserves as indicated, we'll pick this up from the website of the central bank, as at 2 days ago, $37.231 billion. If we set that against our import bill, average for the first 9 months of 2019, that gives us 8.86 months. Yes, 6 months is adequate in terms of cover to stabilize the exchange value of your naira. If you talk about the echo currency, it says 3 months cover if you are looking at the echo currency in the West African sub-region. But for us, we look at Nigeria's international economy, so we need 6 months cover. But 8.86 is too close to 6. I would say it's close for comfort. But there's also a lesson to be taken from that. Argentina had a similar position as at January, February, March, April 2018. But May 2018, within the space of 6 weeks, May to June, the cash Argentina had as external reserve, which was very robust and they were confident about, melted. And why? Because foreign investors trooped out at the same time. It's like when depositors take a trip out of a bank, what we call a bank run, is similar. So that means a major challenge for Nigeria is to continue to sustain investor confidence. Then, of course, I will make reference to this. This gives some kind of perspective to capital importation. Yes, people often say that, capital importation, foreigners are taking their monies out. But I always sit back and say, let me not misinterpret this data. What does it say? If I look at it quarter by quarter, I become jittery. If I look at it on an annual basis, that will tell me that a lot more came into Nigeria in 2019 than in any of the preceding 6 to 7 years, given what the data says. But the real challenge, because the important thing is to always point where the challenge is. The challenge is that the bulk of it is portfolio investment, what we call hot money. And that is why I want to link that to the experience of Argentina. To ensure that money keeps coming in, you must keep investor confidence up there. Now, we opened treasury bills to foreign investors in 2017 July. So that became the window through which a lot of the portfolio investments are coming into Nigeria. Now, recently, we adjusted the rate for treasury bills. So, and if you take that rate today against our inflation rate, any investor in that, who is a Nigerian, by the way, is enjoying negative interest rate. That's negative return on investment. But for foreigners, it still makes sense because interest rates in their jurisdiction is still low. Once normalization begins, and that can happen anytime from now. And why do I say that? It's already in conversation in the US anyway. So, but what is holding US is because inflation rate is still very low. All right? And of course, for them, monetary policy also has gotten to a point where it is no longer effective. That is, there is no room to tinker with interest rate as a driver of growth. So, if we look at that, when those countries begin to normalize interest rates, if our rate on treasury bill still remains where it is, then off they go. And then the gap in our external accounts will open, and that can be really troublesome. So let me go to the final point I want to make here. Yes, the US-China trade war has led into a deal, quite all right. Where China will now buy $200 billion worth of American goods. All well and good. But there was an interpretation somebody gave to it yesterday, and that was in a report by the London Economist. And they said that what kind of goods will China possibly import from the US? And that in fact, that is something that needs to be researched. So but the side to it for us is that there will be lower demand for commodities if China slowed to 6.1% GDP growth rate in 2019. That means China that used to provide the push for the global economy has slowed down. Now, given that demand for commodities also has reduced, and the chances of that picking up again this year very slim. Of course, there will be supply gaps in the US market. Imports from other parts of the world into the USA will become competitive vis-a-vis imports from China. All of those will happen, quite all right. But the real thing here is outflow of investments from China to countries not affected by the tariffs that are connected to Nigeria. China has the Belt Road Initiative, all right? That's the BRI, where they are offering loans to any country willing to take that to develop their infrastructure. As far as I'm concerned, as a Nigerian, if our infrastructure deficit is so high, that means we need to fill that gap. If China is offering long-term loans that are cheap, I have no problem with that. Insofar as we spend it on infrastructure, and insofar as the cost of those projects is also comparable to what happens elsewhere. You remember the story of railway in Ethiopia, that they dealt with $400 million, and what we spent doing Abuja, Kaduna. So let me conclude, because the real people to dimension all this are the panelists. Mine is to raise the issues. Finance Act 2020, yes, it's a step in the right direction. So many things that over many years, let me say decades, that Nigeria had left unattended to and been exploited by especially foreign players, those in services and even those that are involved in reproduction. I will give just a snippet here. Way back in 1979, I was in my final year in the university. I did internship with one of the oil majors, and I was given a very sensitive office, and that office was to receive telexes from the production platforms and then produce a report that will now go to NNPC and Central Bank as the volume of crude oil produced by that company. But there was a formula being used to do that. So not everything produced was disclosed. 1979. Now that was my personal experience. Now my own daughter, our third child, did internship as a petroleum engineering student about 6 years ago with another oil major. Then came back home one day and was fuming and raking. Say, young lady, what is the problem? He said, these people are thieves. I said, which people? He said, well, I'm doing my internship. Now, I didn't mention the names, okay? But also an oil major. Now, my daughter encountered the same thing I saw way back in 1979. So that gives you an idea of the span of time that this has been going on, leakages. What ordinarily should be benefit to Nigeria and also to you and I as Nigerians. So a number of these are addressed in the Finance Act, which of course brings me to the final part of my presentation. What do I expect in terms of growth this year? And what should your own organization be doing? What should you be looking at in terms of opportunities? Now, the World Bank said they expect Nigeria's economy to grow by 2.1% this year. IMF came with its own more recent, 2.5%. But we expect a tempered growth of 2.55%. And why do we say that? Because Nigeria is still spending money on infrastructure. Okay, if we keep spending on infrastructure, that will have an impact on what I said earlier on, velocity of transactions, and of course, ultimately, also help in terms of logistics. If I begin to talk about logistics here, about China, we won't finish this conversation, so I won't go into that at all. But that's a critical area. Inflation rate, I don't expect the rate to come down anywhere. In fact, what I expect is between 12.5 mentioned there and 13%, maybe a little above 13. And why? You cannot escape inflation if the economy is growing. So to expect growth in the economy and also dream of single-digit inflation is an aberration in economics. So that will happen. And of course, there's also an official reason, which is undisclosed, why exchange rate will remain within that band. And the major reason for that is unlikely to be resolved this year. So what we expect to happen there is in 2021. And until that happens, we may not see the exchange rate move from where it is officially. And of course, the way we project outlook of exchange rate in the alternative market is to look at the futures. So if you look at the futures rate, that gives you an idea of what to expect, in another 10 months, 12 months from now. So, and of course, crude oil price, that one, nobody can predict it, but that is what we have as an expected average for the entire year, all right? But why do we expect that? Because as mentioned in the earlier keynote address, the Middle East that supplies most of the crude oil to the global market is ever volatile. It doesn't take much to start trouble there. One man throws a stone to another, and then there's a trouble. So there's no how that will not continue to impact the price of crude oil. So what should government focus on? Human capital development, it was mentioned in the keynote address. Of course, private sector participation in infrastructure development. This government needs to really employ the PPP model, public-private partnership, to deliver infrastructure projects. Private developers are more cost efficient and of course more time efficient than public entities. That is the truth of it. From evidence anyway, not based on sentiment. And of course, I will talk about the need to give incentives to local manufacturing. There are a few other things there. This now is the final part that talks to you and I as people doing business in Nigeria. Estimated population, 203.72 million people as at the 14th of January this year. Now, your organization needs to find its bearing among that population, because everywhere we go around the world and discuss Nigeria, the reference always is to our population, the number. The second thing they talk about, that makes us peculiar, is that we buy anything. If they bring anything to Nigeria, they will buy it, no matter what it is. Quality or no quality, they will buy. So the same opportunity foreigners see, we also can see them. So the question is, who are these people? Where are they? How many of them across the key sectors, and there are 6 key sectors, has your company connected to? And the 6 key sectors in the last 10 years consistently have been agriculture, ICT, of course you see oil and mining there with around 10% of the GDP. We have of course trade, then we have manufacturing, and then real estate. Between those 6, they've accounted for between 74% and 80% of our GDP in the last 8 to 10 years. In fact, the latest data for Q3, and thank God Femi is here, because it's one of those that also process and produce this better quality data for us. Now, the latest data showed that they accounted for slightly over 80% of our GDP. So, and the question is, those people vis-a-vis those sectors, how do you connect your business to them? And of course, it means look at that structure that I just showed now, which is in the pie chart. Which ones are the dominant sectors? I've mentioned there are 6 of them. Which ones are the growth sectors? Those that are growing very fast. And don't forget this in closing. that the new generation of Nigerians that are emerging, that tomorrow will become the decision makers, they don't think now of owning properties to live in. Because what we keep hearing when we interact with them is they live a mobile life. They want to move from one place to another. So if any of them will invest at all in properties, it is to just have it as an investment. Secondly, they are not minded about buying cars. They are not interested in that. And we once said it on this platform. Why do I need to keep 2 SUVs in my garage when all I need from a vehicle is to convey me from one place to another? So choices, habits are changing. And so disruptors are coming on. But the question is, if you don't disrupt your own business, somebody else will disrupt you. So thank you so very much.
Try again for Dr. B.Adedipe. You will agree with me. So, and that's why we're going to be bringing him up. Welcome to the, for economic planning and budget for Lagos State. You're welcome, sir. And of course, we want to have a manufacturing demand. We want to look at how can we unlock the opportunities. Put your hands together as I bring Mr. Emmanuel Nigerian Agribusiness Group, CEO, Bex Foods Limited. And also we have Mr. And because of the in-depth analysis that we listened to, and because of the fact that of this, please join me to welcome an experienced person in the person of Mr. Femi. Put your hands together for him.
The increase in inflation. Unfortunately, in November, the CBN at its MPC had said that the inflation was due to supply bottlenecks from the border closure. On the other side, he also made allusion to the fact that he needs to control the import of money supply on consumer prices. So it's a case of an arsonist and a fire, putting out the fire at the same time. My concern as to building up on this is that, two, what is the implication, what is the real definition of our monetary policy direction? And secondly, how does this fit into how we intend to manage the economy in 2020? Dr. Adedipe.
To see about monetary policy is that it is one of the 3 planks to government policy in terms of fiscal policy. Then we have also commercial policy, and of course, monetary policy. So ideally, there should be what I would call an alignment of those 3 policy planks, which means that if there is a gap in any of them, then the other one should fill that gap. If there is truly harmonization of policies within the government. And you will notice something in the 2020 budget of the federal government. This, in fact, is a high point that was mentioned, and that is to align these policies so that we are not pulling in different directions. But there is also what we call internal consistency of the policy itself. And that's the context in which I put this question. That within monetary policy itself, there should be internal consistency before you now look at this consistency with other policy. Now, the interpretation of an increase in CRR is very simple. We normally will take CRR plus liquidity ratio, then back that out of 100%. That is the sum of those two. Now, that gives you the lending space for banks, which means if you increase CRR, technically, it means you are reducing the lending space for banks. Now, for me, that runs contrary to raising the loan deposit ratio. That is on the one side. Now, the other side to it is that if we raise that up, that means we also intend that banks should lend less. And if banks should lend less, how do we relate that to an economy desperate for growth? So when we interpret it, therefore, we look at how it connects to the overriding objective and goal of policy in the big number, and then bring it back now to the essence of monetary policy as you asked, which primarily is inflation targeting anyway. So the question will be, how do all this work through the intermediate targets, and of course through the transmission mechanism that will eventually deliver the inflation target? So I see some internal inconsistency there. So I find it difficult to relate that particular increase, other than the fact that we are too concerned about liquidity. And we think that there's liquidity surfeit that needs to be brought under check.
Okay. So if that is it, I'll move to which I still say it's about the cost of reducing the cost of managing liquidity rather than liquidity per se. Because cost of managing liquidity prints at about 2.1 trillion. And so if that is the challenge, here's the thing. We have almost another instruments maturing of up to close to 10 trillion by the end of February ending. So this total effective cost by the CIBN will be about 2 trillion. So you still have about 8 trillion surplus floating out there. So nothing has touched that really. How does your industry see this function and also see the government's resort to maybe coming to you to raise, to get more money from your funds?
First, let me use this opportunity to thank CIBN for giving us the opportunity to be here. And to me, I think it is very, very important. I mentioned that we're beginning to see pension industry playing a significant role in the discourse about the Nigerian economy. And what that says is that we are gradually recognizing the pension industry as a catalyst for development, which it truly is. Today, the pension funds, as at end of 2019, is about 10 trillion, which is almost equivalent to the national budget 2020.
Exactly.
Very significant. And from the discourse, starting with the key speakers and to the question raised by the moderator, I think we need to recognize one fact, which is everything that we talk about development, I mean all the issues surrounding developments in the country, goes back to the issue of how do we solve our infrastructural problem, the deficit we have in infrastructure. Government doesn't have the money to fund infrastructure development. Funds has to be generated through some other ways. And here we are, like I said, we have a long-term funds in the pension industry, 10 trillion. So the issue is, how do we really provide a channel, okay, where these funds can be deployed to fund infrastructure development? For us in the pension industry, we are mindful of two things. Number one is safety of the funds, because we are only managing people's money. And we know just people's money is pension. Money that is meant to take care of people. So it is very key consideration for us in the industry. And I think work currently with regard to how do we really create structures where government can really access these funds to fund infrastructure development. Work is ongoing. And relating to the question that you asked me now, I would say that for us in the pension industry, we are keen, because that's what we do. We collect these funds and we invest with the main objective of ensuring that we generate returns that would take care of the beneficiary when they come to access these monies. So the challenge is not really for us as an industry because we are ready. The money is with us. The challenge is for the policymakers and also other players in the private sector to come up with right instruments, structures that will guarantee safety and also guarantee some level of returns so that, like I said, the pension funds can be accessed and deployed for development.
Okay,
Thank you.
Let me pass the mic to Sam. Okay, let us deal with the issue about this, either to reinforce ignorance or either to hoodwink people. Those who understand sovereign infrastructure funding understand that the most important issue around it is about currency risk, because you're not going to be able to, or two things. One, you can either find a way to source the money locally or you go outside. Once you go outside, your major challenge is currency risk. And to mitigate currency risk, you'll find out that there are two types of investments they can really do. Basically, you can either do those greenfield, the new ones, or investment in new technology, but never the old ones, which are basically around airports, whatever. And it's structured around major things on how they can protect their revenues, whereby they can protect revenues from either concessioning or tolling. In your own budget, because we spend more time living the sovereign budget, we spend more time now in my place looking at subnationals, because that's really where we believe the new growth for Nigeria would have to come, focusing on the subnationals. How do you intend approaching financing infrastructure from the state, for example?
Some challenges, because certain instruments that are not generally at your disposal. We're to raise funds for some of the rails, right? And you were going to be dealing with very low but foreign denominated loans, high hedges, and long-term hedges that were not available in this market, given the market. So what we've done basically, to a large extent, controls only a small amount of the grey matter capacity available to it. And therefore, for Lagos, we've said we want to run an inclusive government. It's owned by the federal government. It's important that you either take up revenue somehow, or you take down some of your assets and invest in other assets. Now, but you have this confidence issue as to, okay, when you do that, will you really put it in other assets, especially when you see your capital recurrent ratios moving in the direction in which it is moving. So in Lagos, we've by policy, actually, said that our capital to recurrent ratio should always be in the region of 55% capital and 45% record idea. So in this budget, for example, for 2020, it is 6139. Right. And we did achieve something better than 55-45 in actual performance last year. So we've then, even though these challenges do exist, the solution has to also exist. So what we've done this year is to say, instead of having an endless conversation about critical infrastructure, let's advertise it internationally. Excellent. Let's expose ourselves to the mind share that is available to bring to the table structures that will work for Lagos and for the people of Lagos. So we advertised the 4th Mainland Bridge. We advertised the entire rail structure, right? Because that whole rail asset plan was part of a World Bank rail mass transit master plan for Lagos, right? So we feel that people can invest. But we've also said we need to put our skin in the game. So we've begun some investments into that sector, which is what you see in what we call the blue line. Fortuitously, we now said as part of our trust was that we're going to be very active in cooperating across governments. So on the red line, for example, we're going to be combining with the federal government already doing a rail. Now you can imagine if we are not aligned with them, we'll have to build our entire from Agbado all the way to Ebutemeta. But because of cooperation, they can make the investment up to Ebutemeta and we take it to Oyingo and then to Marina. and then build bus stops.
Okay.
So that is the combined cooperation that is going on both with other governments and with the people to make these infrastructures work.
I'd like to do follow-up, but I will come to Mr. Ejiwe and ask agriculture. But you may address your mind to this in case the audience does not ask it. One, there is a growing notion in the last 20 years that you often start projects in the state, and even though you have a continuum political structure, you have not been a continuous execution along your project lines. And you made mentions of your rail. You may want to go through that one where you have projects that stop along the way, and you're not therefore building a credit of a history of performance and execution, which may affect you. You may also want to train your minds to the fact that you do have issues around where you can do asset stripping in a proper way, which is always open to you, and you've always been able to manage the public. So it's not going to be tolerable as an excuse per se. But having said that, we come to the big elephant in the room, which is what we call, Dr. Adedipe did not address that. He would have been nice to hear from him what he considers to be Nigeria's competitive advantage in 2022. What is it in that budget upon which the whole budget is premised upon, as in like maximizing our advantage? But there's often been the talk that agriculture represents that. Now, it would be nice to hear from Mr. Ejiwe that this whole idea of agriculture, I hope we can differentiate two things. That we separate subsistence farming, which is also part of job creation and whatever, as against agriculture, mechanized-based agriculture, which will grow the economy. That's on one side. Two, to address that, does the finance bill, or either way, the budget which you see, address the fundamental issues that opens up that agri sector for financing, i.e. issues like land, i.e. issues about the models around which you fund it. I will hand over my mic to you so you can actually accommodate.
When I was told that we're having this session here today, and it's the 6th National Economic Outlook session, implications for business in Nigeria. Now, that guided my mindset in coming here today. Fortunately, too, you had somebody like Dr. Adedipe, who, in fact, gave us a background and set the tone. He said, what direction should we go? We should start dealing with inclusive growth, significant reduction in extreme poverty, rural-urban migration, discrimination against urban poor, like happened in other countries, and education gap, but agricultural lifestyle. With these, you now look at the 2020 budget. And looking at 2020 budget is not the big thing to us in the field of agriculture. And have changed tremendously. One of the big things that are before us right now are issues like AFTA, African Free Trade. You have issues like the closure of the border. To people, they see the physical closure of the border, but the economic impact is not felt in places like Lagos, it's felt in the villages, where there are now more and more demands of those basic foodstuff that have been coming in from countries like China and the west coast of Africa, smuggled in. Like the rice war you mentioned, this last Christmas was a tremendous experience for so many people. A number of people who wanted the borders opened, most of them don't even understand what's happening in the villages where over 70% of our people live. If you want to talk about inclusive growth, growth should not be in Lagos alone, or in Lekki and Abuja. It should be throughout Nigeria. And that is also tied to security.
Yes.
Unless we start looking at this holistically, when we do that, we start understanding the kind of central role agribusiness as a policy will play in Nigeria's future development. We cannot compete with the rest of the world in manufacturing aeroplanes or cars. But we have a God-given opportunity. Fantastic land, fantastic weather, large population. How do you bring this together? That should be the direction we should be going. Everybody should start thinking about that. But God works in mysterious ways. Every time we hear that there is a problem in the Middle East, we say may it be further extended. Because these ones go to drive up the price of oil. But every time we hear the price of the oil has gone down, we say, thank God, may it remain down. Why is this? Because as a nation, we have this mentality that we don't need to work hard. As long as the money is there, import it. But we do not see the consequences of those imports on the villages that we have in Nigeria, where 70% of our people live. That's why I'm giving the example. Right now, what's happened is that last Christmas 2018, one of my subsidiaries sold local rice valued at about 150 million, imported rice 280 million. In this last Christmas, we did not sell one grain of imported rice. All the rice we sold was from Nigeria. That, on its own, was valued at almost 350 to 400 million. That money ended up in the pockets of these people in the villages. That is silent economic development and inclusiveness we are talking about, and reducing poverty. But we have not taken this seriously as a policy, as a holistic policy to move forward. After, what I was actually saying to the president of CIBN this morning was that from what we've seen is that a number of people have positioned themselves. A lot of these foreigners, they have now started moving their manufacturing base, their various farms to Gabon and other African countries, because ease of doing business there are far, far better than in Nigeria. Nigeria will not be forced to take those produce under the AFTA arrangement. They are positioning themselves. Nigeria will not become a place, I won't use the word dumping ground. We have a large population that needs these things. To dump means that you just throw it on the ground. No. Nigerians are the ones that are buying it. You have Dr. B.Adedipe when he said that one of the things that people attribute to Nigerians is that they buy anything. And that's true. The West African countries know this. So in going forward, bankers in particular, it's about time they should now start reorientating themselves to doing this business. They have for so many years considered agribusiness as a risky business. Very, very risky. I changed my life 20 years ago when my friends told me that I became a mental case for going into agriculture. I have remained there and I've had the privilege of seeing everything from the beginning. I have lived in a number of villages. I'm even almost a chief in Zango in Gombe State. Spend the night with them. I'm sorry, I have to bring this to us. I spent it with this, I like Haruna. He had 2 wives and had 6 children. When I woke up that morning, I slept with them. When I woke up that morning, I had them talking. I don't understand Hausa that well. And they said, hey, what's happening? Oh, they said that 3 of the children were going to school. I said, how about the other ones? They said, no, they went yesterday. I said, why? They're supposed to go to school every day. Alhaji Haruna just laughed. It was then I discovered that they went to school, who went to school yesterday, left home at about 5:45. They got back at about 5:30 in the evening. They walked 15 kilometers to school and walked 15 kilometers back home. If these were your children, would you send them to school every day? But that is the reality. In this particular case, what did we do? I just got some friends together for Alhaji Haruna, bought them a tricycle, and then they take them to school. Now all the children go to school. Small thing like that changes the whole thing, because I had the privilege of spending time with him, knowing him. If I sat in Lagos in an air-conditioned place like this, I heard about Alhaji Haruna, it does not matter to me. Now he has a face. Those children are the future of Nigeria. They either come and work in your bank or join Boko Haram. The choice is ours. These are the mentalities I'm actually saying, that when we talk about these things, the opportunities are big, are great, but let us look at it from a position of getting involved and getting everybody involved.
And those who would acknowledge those points you're saying as being true, but are there those who would then explain and try to put them in context? And I may be one of such. As moderator, let me put this in context so that we'll all address that, so I can go to the audience for questions. One, you mentioned the border closure issue. You mentioned, we also mentioned misery index. We mentioned that the president talks about poverty. Every one of us seems concerned about different ways in which we look at the same problem. But maybe we want to address our minds at this particular unique forum to focus on the solutions and what works. There's a difference between tokenism and aggregate solutions. There's also the challenge that when you mention things about people moving out of Nigeria, the issues are so many. I can give 5 or 6. One after is one, which is ramifications. Ease of doing business, you also mentioned. Then there's the tax rate issue, which is a critical issue. There's the access to credit. Then the cost of operations. There's mobility around the market. There's much more issues. So before we go out there, gentlemen, is there a way we can talk about something much more positive that we can take away? Because I learned very early this year that as much as Nigerians are pointing to problems of people are moving out, there is a high number of also people who are moving in and who are looking at this country and who are seeing opportunities and who are seeing great things that can be done in this country. So I would like us to piggyback along that way. So Dr. B.Adedipe, I'll start in the same sequence with you, and then I go up to Kabir, to Samuel, and then I'll come back to you, the last one before we talk to them. Thank you. You can use the mic with Sam.
Mr. Adewere raised the African Free Trade Agreement, and then the border closure, and of course security. Now there's a very close connection between them that works this way. As he said, and I agree with that 100% because of my own experience too as a business consultant. I've seen instances of companies citing their factories, plantations in other African countries.
And they move the goods here.
Because they know whatever they produce there, under the free trade agreement, we get it to Nigeria without any duties. So for them, therefore, they look at the environment, as rightly said, and that is the business climate. I mentioned incentives in my presentation earlier on, where the governments of those countries deliberately, and I will give 2 instances there. A country in the West African sub-region had once done that successfully to one of our clients in Africa. That man's factory is there up and running. That same country made an attempt to take innocents from Nigeria in 2011. I was directly involved in that. So I used the case of my client to warn the federal government, because then I was advising. And I said we needed to do something to keep innocents there. And what we did simply was to say, let government introduce a policy that says whatever innocence produces, government will buy. And that to say, bring a policy that says Nigerian government's MDAs will buy vehicles made or assembled in Nigeria and only buy imported if Nigerian made or assembled vehicles are not available. That was the policy we introduced then in 2011, which is the reason innocence is still in Nigeria. Otherwise, we have lost him to Ghana. Let me be specific here. But their government delegation came from Ghana to Nnewi. Then there is also the case of Toyota in South Africa. Toyota has a parcel of land for a factory in Ogun State, which I have been aware of in the last 12 years, where my own company bought a parcel of land there. I was told that we shared boundary with Toyota and Honda, and that they got there 10 years before us, which means these companies had bought land to build factories in Nigeria since about 1998. So the question should be, why haven't they built here? So now that is my view about the trade agreement. Nigeria must be careful in terms of the ratification. We signed it. It will be ratified until it passes to the National Assembly, and then we get back to. Then on border closure. Yes, when it comes to economic policies, there are always pros and cons. Some will benefit, and it will be to the disadvantage of someone else. But the most important thing for us is to do what we call a policy impact review. We do the impact review and then establish that truly there is value coming to us through border closure than what we are losing. But the important thing there is using the example of Malaysia during the East Asia crisis of 1997-98. There were several restrictions on capital flows and several other things. But when they introduced it, it was for a defined period of time. So what we then want to do here, to say we keep the border closed for this number of months, it becomes very clear. The concept then is that for those who benefit from it today, to also exactly build capacity to be able to compete. Now the security thing we raised at this platform, I think when we had the second or third edition of this argument, and what the argument I made there was that if people come to my farm and threaten my life and the life of my workers, we run away from the farm. That means we won't cultivate there any longer. And I gave a simple description. How do we describe the person that makes me so afraid I don't want to go to my farm? Go back to the dictionary. That's a terrorist. Whoever will make me run from a place has terrorized me. It's not until he kills me. The fact that it makes me so afraid to go to my farm has already branded the person as a terrorist. And so if the government truly wants agric to be business, then whoever will make a farmer run away from his farm and not return there to farm and produce to be treated as a terrorist. And the economics of it is very simple. If I don't produce, other farmers also don't. What happens to food supply? Then what is the inflationary impact of that? That's
national security.
It affects food security. Now, this February we're talking about the World Peace Day, but this year the World Peace Day is linked to food security.
And that ties to inflation as well.
Exactly. So it ties to inflation as well. So which of course goes to also affect what central bank is targeting. Unfortunately, which are now they cannot achieve using monetary policy instruments. And so that's my view about it here.
Okay, thank you very much.
On the positive side, I would say two things are likely to happen. And when they do happen, they would really impact positively to the Nigerian economy, to the Nigerian society. Number one is the issue I mentioned in my earlier contribution, which is channeling pension funds to fund infrastructure development. I'm sure a lot of us are aware that the last two meetings of the Economic Council of Nigeria mainly focused on assessing pension fund to develop infrastructure. As it is today, almost 70% of the pension fund is already invested in federal government securities. But if you look at the pattern of borrowing in the past, was not mainly targeted at addressing the issue of infrastructure deficit or funding capital expenditure, mostly. So it is a positive development that governments at federal and state levels are now looking at how they can access pension fund, to focus on infrastructure development. It's going to be positive. And already the industry is discussing with government on this. So we expect this to be taken, to logical conclusions. And when that happens, just like Dr.Adedipe had mentioned in his submission, what is basic, if you are talking of transformation of our economy, is basically to address the issue of infrastructure. Today, if we are able to solve our problem in the power sector alone, that will go a long way in stimulating businesses, especially at the lower levels. And that will impact positively on the economy. So we expect to see pension funds being deployed to critical areas like power, road network, railways, and possibly even housing. So the second positive thing that we expect to happen in the course of this year is something that is already in the law, the Pension Act that we have in the country, which is the provision that allows contributors to use part of their contribution to access mortgage so that they can own houses. It's a provision in the law. We are not yet operating that because the necessary guideline has not been finalized by the regulator. PENCOM has been working with relevant agencies, the CIBN, and some other institutions to finalize that. So we expect that to be concluded this year so that contributors can have the opportunity of accessing part of their contributions to obtain mortgage and own their houses. As it is today, a lot of contributors, especially in the public sector, don't have their houses, they don't own homes, and because of the level of their income, they are not able to access mortgages while they are in service and get houses or build houses of their own. So access to mortgage and eventually own their own houses. And that will go along in addressing the housing deficit that we have in the country. So these two major things are what we expect to happen. There are other developments that are just peculiar to the industry. We are talking of the national economy. We are talking of national development. So I wouldn't want to bother us with some major positive expectations that we have just as an industry in Nigeria. Thank you.
David Cameron talk about development and about governance. He says that governance boils down to two things: the rule of law and taxes. Right? In other words, you can influence the behavior of your citizens through those two, and therefore influence the outcomes. So one of the things we like to say in Lagos State right now is to say we want an inclusive government. We want to be measured by the level of participation and inclusion of our people in governance. So the first thing I would say is that you should get involved, you should speak up, you should express yourself as you want to be led, right? And that will be very helpful in directing the course of government. Which there are all kinds of channels through which you can relate to government. We've published all our phone numbers, and you can call anyone and complain and contribute, right? We really seek your contribution. The second thing is that you should obey the rules of the land. Just obey. Don't follow one way even if you are in the bus and you are not the driver of the bus, you understand? Just be orderly, right, and pay your taxes, right? Lagos State, for example, when you look at the GDP for Lagos, which is about 30 trillion, the amount of revenue which required to sustain that GDP is 15 times what it is getting now. Yeah, you might say that Lagos State has a lot of money, but it has 22 million people. So per capita, there's really nothing, right? When you compare Lagos to Ghana in terms of your GDP to revenue, Ghana does 15 times more, right? We do just 1%, right? So we are not paying enough taxes. I'm not saying your tax rates are not enough, but I'm saying that there are a lot of people that do not pay taxes, right? Even when we look at your pay, those of you who are tax consultants know we do not pay the right tax. We don't calculate it the way it should be calculated, right? So we need to try to do the right thing, because it's when those revenues go up that the capacity of government to act also goes up. There's an infrastructure gap of about $50 billion for Lagos alone, right? If the capex spend for this budget is 711 billion. If everything remains static, we will spend this for 25 years and we will not have covered the gap. So that galvanization and participation is important. I also like to say, take more interest in some of those things that are not roads, like education, like health. Lagos State is coming out with an insurance policy. It says it's mandatory, not because it wants to force people, but because we must take care of the vulnerable, those who cannot access healthcare. So I'd like you to subscribe to that, right? And the reason is that about 2 years ago, we tried to measure the amount of slums in Lagos. Then it was just about 60 slums. Today, just 2 years later, it's about 600. Wow. Now, your capacity to take care of diseases and the spread of diseases is significantly weakened. Now, why is this happening? It's happening because even though Lagos State has a lot to be done, there's a differential performance in other states. And those migration has no impact in their FAC applications. So when there is no consequence for underperformance, right, what you find is that behavior and culture is not developed properly. When you do not enter school because you perform better than the rest, right, then it's a dysfunction in the system that moderates outcome in a direction that the rule of law is completely breached. Now, it's not very difficult to intervene even personally in some of the schools, right? And Lagos State is investing in about 300 schools. We have a budget of about 136 billion this year, which is about 70 billion higher than last year. We're investing in health, but think about it. I was supposed to intervene in a school, right? And I was trying to put my friends together to just give them seats. And when I found out how much it cost, I found that it cost about 70,000, which meant I could do that alone in each class every month. You know, and sometimes participating and intervening is not too big. I have a friend who is sending some children to school in these slums here. It's costing him about 5,000 a child a month to take them to school, to clothe them, and to transport them. Now, you can adopt a child. You understand? So there's something we can all do to get things moving. The government can't do everything by itself. It's huge. Our taxes have not ramped up to the point where we can support the GDP. The impact on our infrastructure of things that wear out our own infrastructure, a lot of that is in your corporate income tax that goes to the Federation and is shared in a manner that is unconnected to the production in those areas. So you have all of those challenges that we need to address. But in the meantime, let us push the envelope wherever we are. Lagos State will continue to do that, and it asks and appeals for your cooperation and your participation. Thank you.
Walk into any school, any of these government schools, just talk to the teacher, say, I just want to look around. Talk to one or two of those children. In fact, talking to them brings joy. That, this big man in suit, it costs you nothing, apart from that time and the humility. Now, go to the, how many of us, I'm talking about not the ladies, because the ladies, even if they are high up in their banks, when they get to the market, they haggle about price. Okay. When they go to ShopRite, they pay the price. But when they get to the market, the poor woman, they haggle with them. God bless you. Now, you gentlemen, take the trouble, walk into the market one Saturday morning, talk to people. It brings you closer to the reality of Nigeria. There are two Nigerians, and they are moving further and further apart. We here are unsafe because we have created so much poverty out there because we don't know. We don't deliberately do it, but we created a ring fence around us. Now come quickly to what Dr. Adedipe on the linking up, and I linked up with the Lagos one too. I have a big farm in a village called Liquidity Village near Atlantic Hall. And what I did about 9 years ago was to get a number of people who are bankers, insurance people and so on, to come into agriculture. They thought to themselves that if this past president of ICANN is mad, I can join that madness. So many of them came, and we formed a group, and we started farming there. Until some people heard that there are some bourgeois who are farming in there, and they started kidnapping our workers. It went on for a very long time. They would ask for 5 million, 4 million, 10 million. So we now went to Lagos State government. Fortunately, the governor was very receptive. We told him what was transpiring, and then he got in the Air Force, Navy, and so on. And they located them there. That the kidnapping died down, but I had already lost about 12 million or something.
Full day, and it's very commendable to CIBN putting all of this power and knowledgeable people together. It's a great platform. I've got a couple of questions, and thanks also to the panelists for the wonderful expose. My first question is to Mr. Tijani. Over the years, and I was extremely delighted to have also worked around pension, and that's starting with the reforms, and when PENCOM had set up the PEN-UP, and we've seen so much work that has happened in that industry that even gives workers comfort for their future. Quite remarkable. Now, recently, moving from keeping all of those funds from government security to looking at opportunities around infrastructure is very delighting, because those were some of the discussions that were had over 10 years ago. Now that this opportunity has come, I've got only one great concern. Taking again what we talked around performance, how do we ensure that even if there is investments of that sort of fund that are tied to the investments from individual workers in Nigeria, how do we guarantee that the investments in infrastructure will perform well and also be able to deliver on the promises? Now, we know what it's like when we look around, even with Lagos State as benchmark, whether we're looking at the infrastructures that, it's a lot of challenge to keep those things going in a country like Nigeria, but performance is a major issue. Even when we take a look at the way that Abuja-Kaduna rail line has been performing, low patronage, worsened by insecurity in the country, it gives concern. I'm extremely excited to see that there is opportunity for investment in infrastructure, but I'm also overwhelmed by performance, and that can be intimidating. Okay. My second question is to Ijawara. The sector that you run is very commendable, and is another one that I'm extremely excited about. There is so much tie between food security and national security. Is there anything that you are doing with regards to assessing this sort of investments opportunities, so that we're not simply talking about infrastructure right now? There are other ways that all of the pension fund can go into. So when you talk about agriculture, infrastructure is important in the areas of transportation, logistics, road, and all of those. More important is also power. For instance, where do you plan to keep the food that we come? Kaduna to Lagos or wherever it is that produce come, 80% of them go wasted. So what are you doing to be able to tap into that opportunity as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Adedipe will help because of his prior involvement. We seem to pay so much attention to budget, the fiscal budget. But I have not seen the architecture for measuring actual performance in this part of the world. I have not seen a gathering where we will say the theme of this gathering is to look at 2019 budget, compare the projected figures with the actual, learn some lessons going forward. If we in the academia, at times you carry out some analysis, I did one, and arrive at some spurious results. While I was lamenting, somebody reminded me that, hey, you are working with budgeted figures, not actual. And I laugh at myself. And that is the predicament we do have. We pay too much attention to planning. What's the actual results? What lessons are we learning in taking further steps into preparing for another year? So it's like we keep going around cycles because accountability is a bit weak at most levels. My second observation, well, talking banking now, and Mr. Idewuri has never failed to say this: banks help, support agric, support agric. We've talked about LDR, 65%, CRR, 27.5, and somebody was saying during the week that banks now have about 6-7% to maneuver in other businesses, interbank, maintain open position, this and that. And like the president said sometimes, that maybe this year, banks need to review their books and their strategies if they end up with some profit figures. Now, it's good because lending is a catalyst of development. But who is addressing other problems? There are so many externalities that affect the performance of those in those segments of the economy that this LDR should help. Who is solving problem of infrastructure? Who is solving problem of, we've talked about insecurity and others. And some of these problems are even much more devastating to the operators in those sectors than financing. If the money is there and the environment is not conducive enough, as we saw in Smiths and other schemes before, is money going down the drain. This generation of bankers will create the bad loans today. Another generation will pursue the bad loans if the environment is not okay. Now, lastly, ease of doing business. Thank you again, Mr. Idewuri. And as you know, I've said this before, I also play in your sector, in Agric, not in Lagos, in my own state, in Ekiti. Now, I have this problem with our mentality as a people. The other day, TI, Transparency International, said we slumped. We were calling them names. When they tell us we've improved on ease of doing business, we roll out the drums. As a player in the agri value chain, the ease of doing business has not been easy for me. At IOD the other day, I took up the MD of NISRA, and I said, in my own state, I am not aware of anybody that is aware of the activities of NISRA to help those in agri value chain. What are you doing to deepen your services? And that is the problem. In my own place, I confronted my own road, I did everything. Cost of operation in the agri sector is so high, and I have not seen practical steps being taken to carry these policies to where they matter, so as to influence the lives of those that matter. My last word for Honorable Commissioner, sir. Last comment, sir. Lagos is trying. In fact, I was trying to review the performance of Lagos some days back, and I saw this eco data, which showed both budget, actual, in terms of key economic indicators you can think of for almost 15 years. I was looking for the same counterpart at the national level. I couldn't find. But do you know why you have problem with taxation? Statistics available show that the formal sector of the national economy contributes about 60% of the GDP. The same statistics show that about 70% of the operators in the formal sector of the Nigerian economy, including Lagos has a fair share. They don't pay tax. Okay. How do you encourage them and bring them into the tax net? What will be the incentives? I think that's the challenge for Lagos.
What would be the incentive?
Mr. Jory, thank you very much, sir. You have the clout, the reach, and the connection to get to the government to assist your farming community. I was in my village on the 2nd of January. That's my practice every year. I have a village in Ibadan called Liquidity village. And I was shocked when I went inside the farmland a little bit. I saw cattle farmland. Those of us who doesn't have the reach and the connection, what do we do? Not only in Oyo State, but even in Lagos. I'm pushing this one to my friend and brother. How are you helping the farming communities? Somewhere in Badagry, I had this number of acres of land fenced, and somebody who is in Badagry said, "Bayo, since you are not using it, let me be using it." One day he got there, the fence had been broken, and cattle rearers were there, doing their own thing. What are you doing as a government? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Performance today. Sam, my question is to you. We want an assurance that there will be more inclusiveness. You've advised that we keep engaging, but you'll agree with me that it's not very sustainable to expect that you will have the far-reaching benefits unless there's some incentivizing, as has been said. Do we go away from here believing that that will receive attention, that there'll be more advocacy, so that we begin to engage in more strategic ways, so that results, and it makes sense. And then the government on its own begin to do that. Because when you talk about it, I align this with what Mr. Ijewe has said here, even though he's going to be speaking with me later about why we have to come here to learn this. One to see is that what he experienced and what he achieved is, more progressively achieved on a widespread basis. The other thing would be the 60 versus 600, like the moderator said, is staggering. Is there a deliberate plan to deal with it? Imagine the fears we have about what's happening in China, Lassa fever, and the like, and it's a 60 versus 600. It's worrisome. Thank you.
Excellent.
Question is to Mr. Tijani, and I just want to piggyback on the question Madam raised earlier on this pension fund and how the government intends to access it for the infrastructural financing. Now, my question is, I heard over an interview, a very senior stakeholder in the government, a minister, talking about that most of the infrastructure they are looking to invest is social-based, their social infrastructure. They probably would not be able to pay back this investment that they want to access these funds for. And we've been very critical around returns, to be able to get back this money to the pensioners. The moderator earlier spoke about that most of the places where these things are done is the assets or the infrastructure that are financed that pays back the returns to the pension fund. So now I'm just trying to clarify. You preview to a lot of discussions on how this might work. He mentioned about that most likely other sectors of the economy, probably raising taxes, will pay to return back these monies because the infrastructure they plan to deploy these funds to are social in nature and would not be able to return these monies back. So from what you're preview to, are we expecting some form of increase in tax, or where is the government looking to finance this infrastructural spend that they want to access this fund for. So we also start to prepare ourselves for probably something that is coming up that we are not privy to at this time.
Thank you. We'll check that.
Rated the agricultural business so highly in terms of risk. So as an accountant, I would like you to advise, how do we really work? Because we know that this whole thing is, it borders mainly around the uncertainties that surround that business as it is. So how do we really work the risk profile of that business in the bank? And then two, Dr. B.Adedipe is also on this. I want to, since you stated something regarding food security as it links to national security, I want to have your opinion on the new Amotekun stuff. Thank you very much.
That in 2019, the reserve would be a cover of 8.6 months. Okay, while in 2018, it was 17.1. And I'm saying, why is that gap so wide? Because if you look at it with the backdrop of all that is being done, okay, by Central Bank of Nigeria, development banks to make it happen locally, why does it seem like we just keep importing? So what are the issues, and at what point are we going to have a reversal of this trend? Thank you.
Implementation and of course review. Now, he asked about an architecture for that, and I will cite two instances. One happened in 2007, and that was the time President Obasanjo was campaigning on behalf of the late President Yar'Adua, and he made a remark that Nigeria should vote for him because the man did not steal money while in office, and that he was going to leave Katsina 6 billion naira in the treasury when he finished his term. Now, when Yar'Adua became our president, I put something before his government relating to this issue. And I made the argument this way, that for a government, the issue should not be that we made a budget last year and we spent it, but rather it should be what were the deliverables the budget was meant to address. So what we should therefore be measuring are the deliverables and not how much we spent or how much was left. I came up with an idea which the man bought. If you recall, in 2008, President Yar'Adua gave the power minister then a target of 6,000 megawatts. Now the story behind it is simply this. When we were working on FSS 2020, the plan was that by this year 2020, Nigeria should be generating and distributing 40,000 megawatts of power. We were then doing in 2007 3,200. So what I did simply for Yar'Adua's government was to say between 2008 and 2020 was 13 years. And that if we're able to add 3,000 megawatts annually and consistently, then over that period we would have added 39,000 megawatts to the existing 3.2. All right? So the logic then was that if we kept to that, they will be talking about over 40,000 megawatts this year. So I then said, the 3,000 I got in my simple arithmetic, add it to what was existing for 2007, make that the target for power minister, and the man adopted it. So he gave the power minister then 2008 6,000 megawatts as a target. So I also used the works ministry to illustrate. A similar thing I also brought before the current government 3 years ago. And then I used the Ministry of Power Works and Housing to illustrate. It has 54 different activities. Yes.
And I said, for every activity in that ministry, as at that time, you can set a clearly defined target. So then, in front of every activity, adopt the traffic light structure, where you have green, amber,
and red, and I put percentages to it. So if the minister scores on an activity anything from 80% and above, he gets a green for that activity. If it is between 60 and 79, he gets amber. Below 60, red. So then the argument will be that for every minister to remain in office, he must score, he or she must score on the average not less than 80%. So, but if he scores a red, that's less than 60, in 3 consecutive quarters, they should either go, or if they see he still has capacity to do something else, then move it to another ministry. That was the architecture. It was a plan given them to the vice president, because he was then in charge of the economy, as president said. Okay? But this concept went to Ministry of Budget and National Planning, because I got a copy of the letter, which it was forwarded from the VP's office. But that was where I died. I can say it because I was involved, and I didn't charge a kobo for it. It was free of charge. That was the architecture that we could have used to drive performance, measuring deliverables, and connecting that to either retaining your job or not as a minister. So that addresses that. Now, the second issue, and I will do that very quickly because of our time. Now, the second address to me is the Finance Act 2020 about SMEs. Now, my understanding of it is that it is still work in progress. But if you look at the list of exempted goods from VAT, a lot of them relate to SME ventures anyway. And as rightly mentioned, if your business earns anything below 25 million naira, no CIT, that's company income tax. So there's quite a lot of provision there that either exempts or protects the SMEs. But the aspect of their input that already have VAT embedded, I think is something we want to also highlight for the government to address. The final one is with respect to external reserves and imports. If you look at the data for Nigeria, between 2016, when the economy went into recession, and end of 2017, imports revived, exports also revived. But as exports continued growing, imports plateaued somewhere. In which case, imports stopped growing. But by 2018, imports also started growing again, along with exports. But something happened last year, and I picked that up from the GDP data. All right? Now, second quarter of 2019, if you profile our foreign trade data, you will find that the structure of our imports had changed. We no longer spend most of our money on food imports. In fact, for the second quarter of 2019, we spent 41.78% on machinery and transport equipment. So when I saw that number, I went to research it further. You know what I discovered? That taking advantage of opportunities, some Nigerians were importing helicopters here and then exporting the same helicopters to South Africa, to United Arab Emirates, and one other country. Because they were taking advantage of the tariff structure, the incentive for transport equipment. So it was well directed. But of course, for them, they saw it as...
It wasn't ring-fenced.
Exactly. So it was not ring-fenced. So people therefore would import helicopters here. Instead of having here as the port of destination, they re-export to take advantage of that tariff structure. So that is why there is a big challenge. It's been on, because I've been a part of that convention since 1987. The tariff structure in Nigeria had always been an issue. And until we address that as well, we can't take full advantage of the trade agreement. Neither can we benefit fully even from border closure as we see today. It's a big issue, tariff structure. Thank you so very much.
Sit down with him, and then if he does not respond, write to us at Nigeria Agribusiness Group. and we shall take your letter to the quarterly meeting we have with the Vice President on issues of agriculture. And that will apply to everybody. We are lucky in Lagos because there is proactive attitude in the governance of Lagos. Any commissioner, any director, they take you very seriously, whoever you are. And I want to say thank you very much for Lagos State. Now, on the issue, which was a lot of things were said, but was summarized by the gentleman who said, how do we rework risk profile? Simple. First, recognize the reality. The reality is this. Those who practice agribusiness are not as educated, as exposed, and as sophisticated as the bankers. What has happened in the past is that bankers don't understand them, they don't understand the bankers. So, what you don't understand, you are afraid of. And the word risk is the word that you normally use to keep you safe. So, what we're actually saying here is get to know them better. I know the number of people. There was a lady who spoke to me from Fidelity Bank today, and I'm sorry for using that, anyway, you're all the same. Fidelity Bank today, and to apply to any other bank, and said, look, we'll come and talk to you and so on. I said, we are risky. Me, it takes me 90 days to grow my tomatoes. There's already a person who is going to take the tomato from me. Is that riskier than the money to give to people to import tomato paste from abroad? So I'm actually saying that for this whole idea of reworking it, talk to us. There are more and more and better educated people going to agriculture. It's no longer our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. It is true that many of them form the bulk of it, but in many cases we've succeeded on this nucleus estate initiative. In Gombe, for example, there are about 300 farmers that are working for me as outgrowers. Now, if you talk to me, I can talk to them. If you go to them individually, they won't even understand your language, you won't understand them. Then you use that word again, what is it called? Risk. We are not as risky as you say we are. Now, because of that, what have many of us done is that we have sold our shares until the stock market itself started collapsing to invest in this. Now, as of today, I've paid off all my loans to banks because I'm too risky for them. Every money I'm spending, I will sell this, go and invest there. I will sell. But if the banks want to come and sit down, first of all, come to my farm. See what is that's happening there. Go and find out what are the plantains used for. Do Lagosians buy plantain? Be part of it. Yes, think of the value chain. Stop sitting down in your air-conditioned offices. Roll up your sleeves, come and join us for you to understand us. Unless you understand us, we can never understand you because you are too high for us. But we are down there, and each of you eats our food. I mean, not be so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm running away, sorry, because I'm wearing another car.
Okay. Tijani first and the Honorable Commissioner, because I need you to take this.
By pension funds. Same thing in US and in Europe, so many countries. They've used pension funds to develop their infrastructure. So the issue now is, here in Nigeria, you are raising fears about how do we safeguard, the funds, one deployed or one borrowed by government to finance infrastructure. I would tell you that the scheme is 14 years old in the country. And from inception to date, what we've been doing on a daily basis is to invest these accumulated funds. And so far, I will tell you that we don't have any issue with regards to safety of the funds. In fact, we've recorded some appreciable returns on the accumulated or contributed funds, largely because we have a very watertight investment guideline developed by the regulator, which all operators are using in doing an investment function. And one key thing I need to mention when it comes to risk management with regards to pension funds, I would like to understand that at the foundation of risk management, we have what we call
asset allocation.
Panelists, for the wonderful contributions, and thank you for having us while we have this. May I invite the panel to wrap up? Thank you.
Thank you so much, the audience, and of course, the president of the institute, Dr. Uche Uno, the first vice president, Mr. Ulubeni, Bayo Ulubeni, and of course, the second vice president, Mr. Ben, Dr. Ben Opara. We are far behind schedule, and so we must bring it to a close. We're sorry, the DMO representative. Issues that were raised, of course, we noted that we have 6 key sectors, and we touched on each of the sectors, namely agriculture, ICT, oil, trade, manufacturing, and real estate. Interestingly, these sectors form 74 to 80% of the GDP, and we spoke extensively on the agriculture, how we can move forward. And of course, issues were raised, and it is important to know that the bankers should not be afraid. All what they need to do is to understand the business climate of agriculture. And from that stand, believe that agriculture will have a better place, and noting from what the government is also trying to do. I want to also, just before we close finally, I want to recognize Mrs. Von Isiche, Director KBL Insurance, former Executive Director Keystone Bank, and a member of the Governing Council. You are very welcome. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this wonderful session.
Who had actually wished to hear, but unfortunately, it's also tied down with some more official jobs. And I would have also wished to share, to hear, and also to learn, from what the audience and what the resource people, have shared with us. I wouldn't know what which area I may want to touch on, only to say that we are still borrowing. Of course, we can't stop borrowing because we run a deficit budget. We can't stop borrowing because we run a deficit budget. Okay, so essentially the job of the DMO basically, okay, is to advise government on borrowing, advise government and then how to manage the already borrowed funds. So as it is today, okay, where we are as at the end of September, the loan portfolio of Nigeria is about 26.2 trillion naira. And I want to add a caveat that out of that 26.2 trillion naira, okay, about more than 25% is owed by the states, including the FCT. Okay, so essentially when you see the figures at times, people get carried away and they think it's the federal government alone. Actually, Lagos State is also involved. Okay, and then of course, all those things, they are part of the So basically, and of course, when you now look at our debt to GDP, and of course, debt service to revenue, for debt to GDP, we are still less than 20%. Okay, and then for debt service to revenue, that's why we have challenge. Because we are not getting revenue as the GDP is growing. So there's a structural problem, of course, which all of us need to address, to get revenue from that growing GDP. Okay, to service our debts. So on this note, I thank you so much for inviting me.
Outside here, just step out. We'll have this photograph. Before then, we're going to have the national anthem and the CIBN. I was looking to see your body language. Let's have a few years. Please don't go after this photograph, because we're going to have a group photograph outside here. Just step out here. And we have it after the national anthem and the CIBN. Then the queue is okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Shall we just...
And a good example was taken from China that had a proper, inclusive growth policy. And that we should, it's not a record science. Example should be taken from China. That discipline of pursuing desired objectives clearly must be there. And the growth, policy should be, inclusive. So that's, part of it. And then we also pay emphasis on infrastructure. The infrastructure is very critical for us to, invest on key infrastructure and invest on human capacity development. And that's, area that can, help jumpstart growth 2020. Yeah. Ijewere is the mainstay because like every other economy, like we said, you tie food security to national security. So it's very critical that we invest in agriculture. We continue to, mechanize agriculture. We should de-risk the value chain. And the government should support, while also the financiers should, understand and appreciate those value chains and then invest in that area because they hold critical lever for growth. So
on the CRR just released by the central bank, I think you will have something to say about it.
You see, the point clearly is that the central bank aims at price stability, which is the main core function. And you see that inflation is ticking up. You have about 800 billion or thereabout will soon be released to the economy. So there will be more liquidity into the system. And so, of course, you have to counterbalance that to make sure that, you do not jeopardize all efforts to curbing inflation. So that area, yes, because of the basic statistics that they have. I've always looked at what had, informed this decision. And they have a better statistics to show. So if they have that, that means, because I don't think the central bank is just out there to inflict pains on the economy, but they have watched it and see if you are going to release that quantum of money into the system, that will, spike up inflation. So the best was to, increase that. So it just trying to manage the both systems.
Thank you very much, President.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And then the changes we expect to happen. Now, when all of these are put in context, and then companies, whether they are profit-seeking or not for profit, make informed choices of strategies. It's a year or so that they can grow along with the economy.
But there are challenges, and even the recent one by the central bank, many are talking about this move. What do you expect? How will this affect businesses?
Well, in a way, the recent increase in the cash reserve requirement to 27.5%, which normally the way we interpret it in banking is you add that to liquidity ratio. By the time you back that out from 100%, that leaves you with less than 50% to start with. And then it means that what banks can lend out is less than 50%. Put that side by side with the loan deposit ratio, which is another policy plank in the monetary policy. It then means that there's a real very tight space for banks to maneuver. So that brings an immediate challenge to the banks on how to operate in 2020 profitably, and at the same time ensure that the loans they give within that short space are also of high quality, because you only make money from lending if the loans are of good quality. But of course, we know what CIBN is looking at in terms of raising that ratio, and that is they are considering the cost of managing liquidity. And just as mentioned during our discussion, not the liquidity itself per se. So it then means when you look at policies, there's always a trade-off. So the issue then for Central Bank of Nigeria is this trade-off in terms of credit space, which is important for growing the economy that desperately needs growth inclusively. You are now trading it off for the costs, reducing the cost of liquidity. So it's a major, major challenge, and that is what faces every policymaker anywhere in the world. So I think for them, therefore, they will still look at the implication of this maybe over the first quarter of this year and decide whether to reverse that or keep it as it is or even raise it higher. But I think what is most important here is to see the impact of that on the business and the economy. So, and then, of course, we take it from there.
So how can the banks address this challenge?
Well, it's a strategy issue that goes on a bank-by-bank basis. And the way it goes is that every bank now will have to take strategy more important. And that is essentially to ensure that they look at not only that policy environment. The way it works is that the policy first interpreted how it will affect the economy, that's the big picture. Then they also will bring that to their own industry, how it will affect banking. And then from there, how it will affect their individual banks. So it is at that level every bank will now respond in terms of the appropriate strategy, which will now be about looking at their loan portfolio across different sectors of the economy, maybe do a portfolio rebalancing, and probably also along the line, look at not only sectors of the economy, but within the tiers of the market. You know, how much of the portfolio will go to first tier organizations, how much to middle market, and then of course, you know, the low end of the market, which is highly risky. So all of these banks will have to play with this year to ensure that within this context, they still make money. And that is why strategy becomes important in the context.